Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to see everybody here this evening. My name is Neil Safier. I'm director of the John Carter Brown Library, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you this evening for the Maury Bromsen Memorial Lecture. Tonight, we have with us Andrés Reséndez, professor of history at the University of California at Davis, and author of The Other Slavery. I won't say much about this book now because I will be introducing my colleague Lynn Fisher to introduce Andrés, but I will say that we are very lucky to have Professor Reséndez with us this evening, since tomorrow morning he heads to New York to receive the Bancroft Prize for this very book. We have a strong record of picking prize-winning books here at the library before they are awarded. So if you get invited and your book has not yet been awarded the prize, we hope that you will get one so that we can continue our tradition. For those of you who like lectures by prize award-winning authors, please join us on May the 12th for a lecture by the Pulitzer Prize-winning finalist, Wendy Warren, professor of history at Princeton University, who will be giving a presentation on her most recent book, New England Bound. She was also invited before she won the prize. That event is going to be held in partnership with the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown and the Rhode Island Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. So we very much look forward to welcoming both of those constituencies and colleague institutions to the library. Indeed, it has now been approximately 10 years since Brown University published a very important report, the Slavery and Justice report, that gave rise to the creation of the Center for the Study of Slavery of Justice here at Brown. Likewise, the university is now in the process of beginning the search for a director of a future initiative, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative here at Brown. Part of this lecture, and inviting Professor Reséndez, is to showcase the way that we hope that the John Carter Brown Library will also be an important resource for this new initiative. Since in many ways the concerns of the book, The Other Slavery, is very much at the heart of the concerns of the library and its collection. Chronologically and geographically, the book moves from Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492 to the exploration of the American Southwest in the 1840s. Thematically, it addresses one of the crucial questions of contemporary scholarship, that of human bondage and unfree labor, with an explicit nod to the question of African servitude and an interest in broadening the question while remaining conscious of the specificities of each case. For those of you who are familiar with the history of this institution, you will know that it was, of course, in the 1840s that John Carter Brown began to collect the books that would sit at the core of his collection. How directly aware he was of the broader national question regarding Mexican and U.S. sovereignty during this period is not immediately clear from the correspondence he maintained with his book dealers and librarians. However, it must be said that one of his earliest librarians was John Russell Bartlett, co-founder with Albert Gallatin of the American Ethnological Society and one of the surveyors who was sent in the wake of the Mexican-American War to determine the boundaries between an expanding United States and a diminishing Mexican Republic. These questions are part of what we hope to be addressed and examined over the course, really, of the next decades in thinking about the ways that institutions are born out of, but then hopefully serve the interests of scholarship related to important questions of imperialism and cultural exchange, contact, and other more nefarious activities as well. Before I introduce my colleague Lynn Fisher, I wanted to mention a few words about the benefactor of this evening's lecture. Maury A. Bromsen was a bibliographer, bibliophile, and so-called bookman with a major connection to the JCB for many years until his death in 2005. Not only did he provide the library with a legacy that supports tonight's annual lecture related to the history of the Americas and Latin America in particular, but his support also makes possible an annual concert. This, I think, will be held in November of this coming year, funding for our curator of Latin American books, and an ongoing cataloging and conservation effort. Mr. Bromsen also left 10,000 books to the John Carter Brown Library, ranging in a time from the earliest 16th century through to the late 20th century, and in geographic coverage from Argentina to Canada. He would have doubtless been thrilled to be present at this lecture, which also spans the areas of interest that were dear to his heart. With that, I will invite my colleague Lynn Fisher, Associate Professor of History, to introduce our evening speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Terrific to see you all out here in such a lovely evening. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure, distinct pleasure, to introduce tonight's speaker, Andrés Reséndez, and welcome him to the John Carter Brown Library here this evening. To say at the outset that Andrés is a colleague in the field and a really terrific one at that. I've enjoyed getting to know him in a variety of contexts over the past couple of years, circling panels together and talking about research, and I found him to be one who is always willing to take extra time to talk and to share his own research even at times, which is fantastic. So you all are in for a treat tonight, I can assure you. Andrés Reséndez is a full professor at the University of California at Davis, an institution that I know at least a few faculty members here have a warm spot in their hearts for. He received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 1997, having received his BA in international relations in Mexico in 1992. I'm wondering if you could do something with that international relations degree from Mexico at this moment in time here. Next book, perhaps. Professor Reséndez is the prize-winning author of 2 monographs and 4 additional edited books, as well as over 15 essays and book chapters in both English and Spanish. His most recent book, The Other Slavery, was, as we heard, recently awarded the highest honor in the field of history, the Bancroft Prize. Is also a finalist for the National Book Award, which speaks to the accessibility of this book, I think, in some ways. You found a way to engage faculty and people in the profession, within the field, and also engage people on the streets, as it were, as well. No small feat, and something that we should all aspire to. As those of you who have read this book well know, it's an incredible tour through the long and immensely sad and painful history of indigenous enslavement in the Americas, including the western United States in the 19th century. I know you will enjoy his talk tonight, drawn from this excellent recent book. The talk is titled The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrés Reséndez.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Neil, for extending this invitation. Thank you, Lynn, for this gracious introduction. Tara, for all the help. And thank you all for coming. I cannot think of a more appropriate and inspiring setting as this one to talk about these gloomy subject. So let me get to that, and thank you for carving out some time to come to this event. So slavery is the topic at hand, And it's a word that brings to mind bodies stuffed in the hold of a ship, or white apron maids bustling in an antebellum home. History books and movies such as the ones I'm showing here continuously reinforce the notion that slaves were black Africans imported into the New World. We may be aware that in the long sweep of history, peoples other than black Africans have been held in bondage, but we seem still unable to escape our historical myopia. So as both Lynn and Neil pointed out, my recent book, The Other Slavery, tells about that other system of bondage that targeted Native Americans, a system that was every bit as terrible, degrading, and vast as African slavery, and yet many Americans know relatively little about it. According to my estimates, anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved from Columbus all the way to the end of the 19th century. And interestingly, in contrast to African slavery, which targeted mostly adult males, the majority of these Indian slaves were women and children. It was a big deal, but somehow we have chosen to forget much about this. And to get a sense of just how neglected a topic this is, try this. Get into Amazon and type in African slavery, and you will turn over 16,000 books and counting on the subject. However, if you type in Indian slavery, you will find instead books about the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, and perhaps a couple of dozen specialized monographs on native slavery held in bondage, although as some of the members present here, things are changing and scholarship in this area is intensifying as we speak. But for the moment, the consequences of this imbalance is quite plain. Whenever the conversation turns to slavery, people typically imagine black slaves. Virtually no one ever thinks about Indians. It is as if each group could fit into a neat historical box. Africans were the ones enslaved, while Indians either died off or were dispossessed and confined to reservations. Now, I have to start out by emphasizing that Indian slavery was most definitely not a European invention. Mayas and Aztecs took captives to use as sacrificial victims, as all of you know. Iroquois peoples waged campaigns on neighboring groups called mourning wars to avenge and replace their dead. In the Pacific Northwest, male Indians offered slaves as dowries to finalize elite marriages. Along with the rest of the planet, Native Americans enslaved each other for millennia. So the images that I'm showing you here, and this is just by way of illustration. On the top left, you have the beautiful murals at Bonampak showing Maya lords with what are clearly slaves surrounding them. And of course, down here, we have the Codex Mendoza, where slaves are depicted so commonly that the convention to represent these was by having them held by the hair. And you can see them there and clearly identified as cautivos, captives. So it was not new, but with the arrival of Europeans, these pre-existing practices of bondage, originally embedded in very specific cultural contexts, became commercialized, expanded in unexpected ways, and came to resemble the kinds of human trafficking that are recognizable to us today. This transformation began with the earliest European explorers. During his second voyage to America in 1493, Columbus sent dozens of Indians from the Caribbean, and accompanying them was a candid letter addressed to the Spanish monarchs. And let me quote just one line to give you a flavor. "May your highnesses judge whether these Indians ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year and an infinite number of women. And may you also believe that one of them would be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those that I'm shipping out now." So thus, Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates that we commonly associate with African slavery, but which in fact can be traced back to this earlier type of slavery. Eventually, all European powers became important participants in the Indian slave trade: the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. But Spain, by virtue of the enormous and densely populated colonies that it ruled, became the dominant slaving power. Spain was to Indian slavery what Portugal and later in England were to African slavery. Ironically, Spain began by forbidding the enslavement of Indians, yet this categorical prohibition did not stop generations of determined conquistadors and colonists from taking natives on a planetary scale, from the eastern seaboard of the United States and even further north from Canada to the tip of South America, and from the Canary Islands all the way to the Philippines archipelago. And the fact that this other slavery had to be carried out clandestinely made it even more insidious. So this is a tale of good intentions gone badly astray. The Caribbean was the laboratory of conquest, and it was also the first, and quite likely the worst, native slaving ground in the world, as Lynn might be able to tell you. At contact, the Caribbean sustained a large indigenous population. Yet, from this high point, a tragic demographic collapse ensued. By the 1550s, merely 2 generations after contact, the natives, so memorably described by Columbus as quote-unquote affectionate and without malice and quote-unquote having very straight legs and no bellies, had ceased to exist as a people. As any school child knows, smallpox was a major reason for this devastation. But blaming everything on unintended biological consequences is just too easy and not borne out by the sources. Take, for instance, Hispaniola. So this is the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So you can see it right there in the middle of your screens, and here's a blow-up map of it. Italian demographer Massimo Livi Bacci has recently made the crucial point that the first certain documentation of smallpox in Hispaniola appears only in 1518. And yet, even though 26 years passed before the first documented cases of smallpox began to appear, the native population of the Caribbean found itself already on a clear path towards extinction. At contact, Hispaniola may have had a population that we can reasonably estimate at between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants. By 1508, that figure had fallen to 60,000. By 1514, it stood at merely 26,000, according to a fairly comprehensive census, and no longer guesswork. And by 1517, the number had plunged to just 11,000 Native Americans. In other words, and in sum, 1 year before Europeans began reporting smallpox, Hispaniola's population had dwindled to perhaps 5% or less of what it had been in 1492. While it is impossible to rule out completely the possibility of unreported epidemics, it is obvious that other factors were at work in the early years. And as it turns out, Europeans found the largest deposits of gold on Hispaniola, and they quickly put the residents to work. So this beautiful drawing from Oviedo shows the way in which these enterprises took place. So these 3 Native Americans, in fact, represented 3 different groups of workers in the early gold mines of Hispaniola. So the one on the right-hand side represent the superficial digging that went on. The second, the person in the middle, represents the workers that essentially carried these loads of sand from the place where they were dug up all the way to the stream. And a third group of Indians, usually women, were there with these pans, they're called bateas, very large wooden pans, to wash away the dirt and leave the tiniest specks of gold at the bottom. By the early 1510s, the numbers of Indians in Hispaniola had plunged so drastically that the remaining population was no longer able to provide enough labor for the gold mines, let alone for planting and doing all the additional work that needed to be done in the island. So to replenish the dwindling Indian population, European slavers fanned out to the neighboring islands, and thus the demographic cataclysm spread out throughout the Circum-Caribbean. So this map that I'm showing you here is built out of the slaving licenses that had to report where these slaving expeditions originated, where they went to, and so you can see that some of the large islands, especially Hispaniola, but also Jamaica and Puerto Rico, were the origins of many of these expeditions, and they found out all the way to, say, the Bahamas, which were known as the useless islands because they found no gold there, but there were Indians who could be moved to a place where they would be of more use. The northern coast of South America, the coast of Florida, etc. Now, gold was the initial impetus for this need for large amounts of indigenous labor. And in the United States, when we think of gold, the unavoidable reference is, of course, to the California gold rush. Altogether, California produced some 3.7 million kilograms of gold, and in the process attracted some 300,000 peoples from the rest of the world. It was a major phenomenon. And however, to put things in context, here in this chart, I'm putting that amount of gold extracted from the California gold rush on the right-hand side. These are the small bars on the right-hand side in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, etc. But these gold rush was preceded by an earlier silver rush that, in terms of duration and in terms of output, was a lot bigger. I mean, just to give you a sense, so there you go. In terms of just output, what I found, and it took me a while to put together these numbers in kilograms, so I'm comparing kilograms of gold versus kilograms of silver. What I found was that Spaniards extracted some 12 or over 12 times as much silver as the gold in the California gold rush. So what you have to imagine is 12 California gold rushes strung out in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So in terms of duration, it was a much longer period. And in terms of the geography, you may have seen some maps of the silver mines of northern Mexico. This is the most comprehensive inventory of silver mines that we have. And you can see that typically people talk about the silver mines of northern Mexico, but in fact that silver rush originated in central and southern Mexico. In fact, if you go from Mexico City to Acapulco, you pass by the town of Tasco, which was a silver mine developed by Hernán Cortés himself, and many others in the region. And it was only gradually that these silver miners moved through the western slopes along the Pacific all the way north, then into the central plateau where they found some of the largest silver mines, and then gradually moved slowly north, practically all the way to the border with the United States, as you can see in this map. So it was an incredible silver boom that required a lot of people. If this fantastic silver boom had occurred in the 19th century, Mexico would have become a worldwide magnet like California. In an era of newspapers, steamboats, and widespread transoceanic travel, there is little doubt that the great Mexican silver mines would have lured immigrants from all quarters of the world. But because this boom predated all of these communications and transportation conveniences and unfolded at a time when the Spanish monarchy prohibited all foreigners from going to the silver districts, Mexico had to do with its own human resources, especially Native Americans. California attracted 300,000 people, yet colonial Mexico had to satisfy a hugely greater demand for labor with no access to volunteer from the rest of the world. Here's a picture of the mines of Guanajuato in 1905, I mean much later, but you still get a little bit of a sense of how these mines operated. Basically, silver mines require you to follow the veins, usually deep down. Some of the shafts that were constructed for these mines were the deepest man-made shafts in the world. It required you to bring up the ore, crush it, mix it with some toxic reagents like mercury, and mix all of that. So it was a very labor-intensive kind of a process, as many of you know. So local communities were the first to be pulled into the system, but eventually these people ran out, and labor recruiters and slavers fanned out into a catchment area that extended into California, into New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and these labor connections explain a great deal of the historical experience of that whole region. For instance, in the summer of 1680, the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico rose up and launched the most massive rebellion Spaniards experienced in North America since the early days of conquest. The nervous center of this movement was the Pueblo of Taos in northern New Mexico. So Taos is right at the top. This is like the topmost pueblo out here. So from inside a kiva, or underground chamber used for ceremonial occasions, a local shaman named Popeye dispatched runners to more than 70 Indian communities, some of them as far as the present-day Hopi Reservation in Arizona, some 300 miles away. Popeye's plan was to get all of these indigenous communities to rise up on the same day to overwhelm the much smaller Spanish population living in this region. And to this end, these runners carried an extraordinary device, a cord of yucca fiber containing as many knots as there were days before the insurrection. And by untying one knot every day, each community would know exactly when to strike. The revolt that swept New Mexico on August 10, 11, 1680 destroyed houses, ranches, and churches, and succeeded mightily. Within 2 months, all the Spaniards living in New Mexico were either dead or had been driven out of the territory. Now, writers have emphasized the religious aspects of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. They have focused on the charismatic Popeye and his ability to coordinate so many pueblos. And these authors have also been rightly impressed by the burning and defacing of churches, the torturing and killing of friars during the uprising, etc. Of course, explaining the motifs of people in remote times from our own is a dicey business. And of course, rebellions are seldom triggered by a single cause. However, in my book, I tried to make the case that while religion was certainly a factor, the Spanish enslavement of New Mexican Indians played a major role in triggering this massive rebellion. For one thing, rebellion leaders explicitly talked about it. One of the demands of the rebels was, and I quote, that all classes of Indians forcibly held by the Spanish be given back to them. One of the rebellion leaders, for example, asked that his wife and family be returned to him. So clearly there is very good evidence for these. And in addition to that, the geography of the uprising is just as suggestive. So the map I'm showing you, shaded in gray, is the area of the rebellion. The rebellion is called the Pueblo Revolt, but in fact it encompassed a variety of peoples in addition to the Pueblos. Some people call it the Great Northern Rebellion or the Great Southwestern Rebellion, whatever term you want. But if you consider this greater geography of the rebellion, and if you plot that against what I call the corridors of enslavement, so New Mexico basically became an area sending workers and products to the silver mines of what is now southern Chihuahua, especially this gigantic, or not gigantic, but very significant mine called Parral, Chihuahua. You can see that there is a great correspondence between those corridors of enslavement and the geography of these movement. One of the most fascinating aspects of this phenomenon of Indian slavery is the involvement of the Indians themselves. Native Americans participated in the enslaving enterprise since the very beginning of European colonization. However, at first, they played a secondary role to the Europeans, who, after all, possessed the most developed warfare technologies, especially horses and firearms. Indigenous peoples became local suppliers, junior partners, guides, guardsmen, and intermediaries. But with the passage of time, Native Americans came to acquire European weaponry and horses of their own. And as they increased their power, they came to control a larger share of the traffic in natives. By the 18th and 19th centuries, they had taken control of much of the business. No other nation attained the spectacular success of the Comanches, which became the preeminent suppliers of indigenous slaves to other natives, as well as European colonists in the Southwest. So here's a map of their expansive territory wedged between Texas and New Mexico called the Comancheria, which became a major trading center as recent works by historians such as Pekka Hamalainen, Brian DeLay, Joaquin Riballa Martinez, and others have made clear. So according to one witness, in 1744, Comanche trading parties traveled, and I quote, more than 1,000 leagues from New Mexico in the course of a year. So that's more than 3,000 miles in the course of a year, acquiring captives and returning to offer their loot in the trading fairs of New Mexico. One missionary recorded the enthusiasm caused by the arrival of one of such trading embassies, and I quote it, "Here the governor and his lieutenants gathered together as many horses, metal tools, and everything possible as they can for trade and barter by these barbarians, in exchange for deer and buffalo hides, and what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slaves, men and women, small and large, a great multitude of people." For Comanches themselves, the Indian slave trade was not just a business, but a way of life. Comanches sold some of their slaves, but they retained a large portion of their captives. One witness noticed that, quote, "nearly every family among the Comanches had one or two captives. Many of the captives were women who were incorporated into Comanche society as secondary wives and were put to work immediately. Some of them processing the meat and the hides of the bison. So, hunting a bison was relatively easy for a skilled warrior, but then processing that ton of rotting meat and hides was a very different proposition that required a lot of work. And women, women slaves often were the ones providing this labor. In addition to women, boys were the other significant contingent of slaves in Comancheria, and their main occupation was tending the animals. So as Comanches grew stronger, they accumulated horses and mules, and managing these herds required prodigious amounts of labor that neither warriors nor women were able to provide. And so it was not uncommon for such boy slaves to be in charge of herds of 50, 100, 150 horses or more. Grueling work, especially in the winter months. For Comanches then, and other groups, I just singled this one because this is the most obvious example, slaves constituted a very versatile commodity that could be used and exploited as an underclass. They could be used as pawns that could be exchanged for kin members captured by other groups, or simply as the most ubiquitous form of currency throughout the region. Indian slavery engulfed the entire American continent, but the timing varied depending on the region. By the 19th century, Indian slavery had nearly disappeared in the eastern seaboard. In colonial times, the Carolinas had been a major Indian slaving ground. New Englanders had impressed rebellious Indians and shipped them to the Caribbean. French colonists in eastern Canada had procured thousands of native captives from the interior. However, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the traffic of natives dwindled in many of these areas and was often replaced by African slavery. Yet, Indian slavery continued to thrive in the West, and the best evidence comes from letters and diaries of westbound Americans. In New Mexico, for example, James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent of the territory, could not hide his amazement at the sophistication of the Indian slave market. And I quote him, "The value of the captives depends upon age, sex, beauty, and usefulness. Good-looking females, not having passed the sear and yellow leaf, are valued from 50 to 150 pesos each. Males, as they may be useful, 1/2 less, never more." Similarly, California may have entered the Union as a quote-unquote free soil state, but American settlers soon discovered that the buying and selling of Indians was a common practice. As early as 1846, the first American commander of San Francisco acknowledged that, and I quote, "Certain persons have been and still are imprisoning and holding to service Indians against their will," and warned the general public against that the Indian population must not be regarded in the light of slaves. His pleas, however, went unheeded. The first California legislature passed the Indian Act of 1850, which authorized the arrest of quote-unquote, quote, vagrant natives who could be quote-unquote hired out to the highest bidder. This act also enabled white persons to go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children for indenture. According to one scholarly estimate, the Indian Act of 1850 may have affected as many as 20,000 California Indians, including 4,000 children kidnapped from their parents and used primarily as domestic servants and farm laborers. Mormon settlers arrived in Utah in the 1840s. This is the map that I'm showing, that is showing their peregrination across the continent. They were looking for promised land, only to discover that Indians and Mexicans had already turned the Great Basin into a slaving ground. The area was like a gigantic moonscape of bleached sands, salt flats, and mountain ranges inhabited by small bands no larger than extended families. Early travelers did not hire their contempt for these quote-unquote digger Indians lacking horses and weapons. So these Indians actually ate their horses because ecologically they lived on grasses that the horses also ate. So it was better to eat the horses rather than keep them. So it was an ecological adaptation to these regions rather than they were especially savage and as observers without any idea immediately noted. Whatever the case, these vulnerable Paiutes became easy prey for mounted Indians. Brigham Young and his followers, by establishing themselves in the area, became the most obvious outlet for such captives. Hesitant at first, Mormons required some encouragement, and so slavers tortured children with knives or hot irons to call attention to their trade, or threatened to kill any child that went unpurchased. Brigham Young's son-in-law, Charles Decker, for example, witnessed the execution of an Indian girl before he acceded to exchange his gun for another captive. In the end, Mormons became buyers and even found a way to rationalize their participation in the human market. Buy up the Lamanite children. That's what Mormons call Indians Lamanites for reasons that I can explain if you want. And educate them and teach them the gospel so that many generations would not pass before they should become a white and delightsome people. It was the very same logic that the Spanish conquistadors had used since the 16th century to justify the acquisition of Indians. So persistent and widespread was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown prohibited native bondage under all circumstances as early as 1542 with the so-called new laws. Yet the traffic continued. To retain mastery over the natives, European owners resorted to a variety of euphemisms and subterfuges that amounted to slavery in all but name. Another attempt at abolition occurred in the early 19th century under Mexico. Mexico proscribed all forms of native bondage and extended citizenship rights to all Indians who had been born in what was then Mexico's territory. Yet, Indian slavery continued. One more opportunity arose immediately after the Civil War. The United States Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited both slavery and involuntary servitude. This formulation, of course, opened the possibility of liberation of all Native Americans held in bondage in the West. However, in various rulings in the 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court opted for a narrow interpretation of the 13th Amendment that applied primarily to African Americans, but generally excluded Native Americans. Congress also passed an act abolishing the system known as peonage, defined as, quote, the voluntary or involuntary service of labor of any persons as peons in liquidation of any debt or obligation that exists in various Western states. That system of peonage was absolutely integral to these other slavery in the West. The Peonage Act of 1867 was certainly important and a step in the right direction, but once again, the written word was not enough to eliminate practices that had been going on for centuries. Forms of bondage continued through the 19th century and in some remote areas well into the 20th century. Today, 45.8 million people in 167 countries live in some form of modern slavery, according to the latest estimate of the Walk Free Foundation. Slavery is forbidden all over the world, yet not a single region of our globe has been spared from this scourge. Slavery continues to thrive because its beneficiaries resort to debts or prison sentences or some other subterfuge to compel people to work under the threat of violence and offering absurdly low or no compensation. With this growing awareness about present-day slavery, what lessons can we derive from the 400-year experience of Native Americans with the other slavery? It seems to me that the emphasis on the newness of the contemporary forms of bondage is, once again, myopic. Many social scientists trace the beginning of this new slavery to the end of World War II, or to the economic liberalization of the 1980s or the 1990s. They point to the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the origin of the sex trade involving Eastern European women, and so on. One cannot deny that such developments indeed promoted and accelerated the traffic and exploitation of humans. But as I have tried to show in this brief presentation, the mechanisms of coercion that underpin such practices are much older. Only by contemplating this longer trajectory can we gain a measure of the breathtaking dynamism and staying power of this other slavery and its related forms of involuntary servitude and the tremendous difficulties of ending it. Thank you very much. Okay, so I don't know how we're doing in terms of time.
We have plenty of time for questions, and I can imagine a lot of people who want to ask. So
absolutely.
Please, the floor is open.
Please. Yes.
In the far west, what kind of activities were the slaves involved in? Native Americans.
You mean like California and places like that? Sure. Well, as I said, many of them were involved in mining, for example. Many of them were involved in domestic service. So in California specifically, it's a good example. So the mission system in California was dissolved in 1833-34, and the idea was to give land to those who were in the missions and give them tools and make them into small farmers. But as you would imagine, what really happened was a land grab by the well-connected who end up carving these enormous ranches, maybe 100 of these like enormous properties. And if you wanted to make those ranches produce something, you had to get Native Americans to do it because technically African slavery had been outlawed by Mexico since 1828. And the so-called coolie trade would not start until later. So many of these Indians who had been in the missions were inducted into these ranches. And in other cases, Indians who had not been brought into the missions were targeted. in Northern California, in the region where I live, General Vallejo was the man in charge of the frontier army, and there are plenty of records about his forays into various regions to bring Indians into the ranches that he controlled.
How about Utah?
In Utah, they were, interestingly, Utah had a servitude law passed, as many as also California and New Mexico. And in Utah, if you look at so there were many children, and the servitude law is very interesting. First of all, it is longer. The term of servitude is longer than anywhere else. So it was 20 years you had to be in servitude. You had to be, if you were in this system, you had to be clothed, you have to be sent to school, but otherwise, you were available for the work. Ranch work, or so that's the kind of work to which they were subjected. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Thank you. I really look forward to reading the book. I'm wondering how in your research you decided when someone was a slave and wasn't a slave. So I'm right now reading Northern South American accounts, and they talk about seizing indios de servicio, and then there's the Encomienda example.
Totally.
And so obviously there are times when you don't see the word esclavo, but...
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a central question, and one that I needed to tackle. If I wanted to start counting them, you need to know who they are, how to do that. And so point number one is that I wanted to give a realistic sense of that, because legally, right, slavery only existed until 1542, and then after that it was abolished, so people tended not to talk about it. So what I decided to do was to identify 4 traits that made these institutions that I'm focusing on slave-like, or in some cases, yeah. So one was that these Indians were forcibly moved from one place to another, as I was telling at lunch today, because you needed to move them because you couldn't leave them, you couldn't enslave them and use them close by to their kin because you opened yourself to retaliation. So these needed to be moved to another place. In almost all cases, that is the case. Once these Indians were transported to the place of work, second of all, they were unable to leave, whether on account of a debt or because they were serving out prison sentences or whatever. They were not able to leave the workplace. Third, violence, or at least the threat of violence, was used to obtain compliance. And fourth, they were paid nothing or something that was so small as to be basically symbolic, right? So in some cases, it's easy to say, oh, well, that was not slavery because they are being paid, but they are being paid next to nothing, right? So these 4 traits, in my mind, make them akin to slavery. So that's one. So because the colonial terminology was meant, if you look at the history, to obfuscate this, that's why I tried to go beyond the colonial nomenclature and try to look at to make some fundamental distinctions between free and unfree labor. So number one, and the second justification is that actually the people themselves, when you have some judicial proceedings, specifically told about their circumstance as slave-like or worse than slavery. So even though to us in the 21st century, these Indians, these repartimiento Indians or these indentured servants may fall into different categories, to them it was not like that. So that's my response to that. Yes?
So I was wondering, you got into this a little bit towards the end of your presentation, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about whether you see in the colonial period specifically niches or developments between where African slaves are being used and where Native American slaves are being used, and if there's any sort of correlation or does it just seem sort of arbitrary in terms of which types of slaves are used for what?
I don't think it's arbitrary at all. I think that's one fantastic area for research. So I cannot give you a definitive answer to exactly the patterns, but I can tell you that both Indian slaves and African slaves were often using the same site. And in fact, the prices, again, we were chatting in lunch about this, the prices structure the way in which they operated in these sites. So for example, I showed you So Parral is that silver mine in southern Chihuahua, just directly south of New Mexico. So that's where all those lines converge. Parral was the largest concentration of Indians at that latitude. So from there, from northern Mexico all the way to the end of the New World, that was the largest concentration of Indians. And it also had 1,000 black slaves. Half of them were slaves, black slaves who had existed in New Spain, but half of them had been imported directly from Africa, some of them from Eastern Africa, which boggles the mind to think about how they got all the way there to Parral. But these African slaves were 3 to 4 times as expensive as Indian slaves. So if you were a rational, miner, you would use your cheaper labor into the most dangerous underground operations, and you would use the more expensive slaves and other workers into above ground, safer operations. So that's the kind of thing. So the two do hang together. And this is just one example among many. But clearly the presence of African slaves influenced how Indian slaves were used and vice versa. So, yes?
I just have 2 questions. One is maybe an obvious one. Was the slavery also hereditary, like the African? Hereditary.
Yeah.
And also the other question is, with African slaves, we know that it's connected now with the history of capitalism. Could you talk a little about the connection with Indian slavery and history?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the questions. Well, so first of all, Indian slavery was illegal, right? So it didn't, in practice it didn't exist. It was not a condition passed down from one generation to the other, at least legally. And in fact, there is evidence that some of these Native Americans were able to move even within the span of a generation to, rise up and move into menial types of job, but elevate their position to something other than a servant. Having said that, I have also encountered instances in which this condition was indeed passed down from generation to another. For example, I have looked at some peonage cases. So peonage being that system in that you obligated yourself to a debt, and these debts were often passed down from parents to children. So it was not a racial. So in other words, it did exist to some extent. I mean, that's a very unsatisfying answer, but that's the best I can do. As far as how important Indian slavery was to the accumulation of capital, that's a very interesting question that I don't address in the book at all. But I mean, just by looking at the sheer numbers and their presence in some of the most dynamic areas of the economy of New Spain and later the Southwest, I think that that's a very exciting element to add to the very interesting conversation taking place in African slavery and the origins of capitalism. So, yeah. Yes?
First of all, I want to thank you very, very, very much for sharing this history. And I'm just wondering, I am from a mixed blood Wampanoag. We're on Wampanoag land here in southeastern New England. And I'm just wondering when the bridges will be built on the west and the eastern side to show the commonalities and the systems that really originated here on the eastern shore. That was the first institution of racism and slavery and indentured servitude. That doesn't seem to get spoken about as much as what's happened on the west coast, as what has happened on the east coast. And for my peoples, it is my individual belief, and I think also the belief of many of the people who greeted the newcomers here, that we were since our war was in 1675. One of the first indentured servants that built many of the buildings and cleared many of the lands that this university now sits on. So I'm wondering when the West Coast will meet the East Coast so that we can really understand the totality of a system that was built to demoralize, Christianize, and assimilate indigenous people that to this very day are still fighting for our own sovereignty.
Okay, well, thank you. As I mentioned, there is research going on about this phenomenon all over North America, all over the Americas, in fact. So I think in terms of, so again, my own work really focuses on the Southwest, so I can't comment on what went on around here. But I do know that, we have scholars right here in this room working on this question as we speak. I also know that there were human connections. So, for example, Brett Rushforth's book has shown how Apache captives were sold across vast geography all the way to what is now Canada. So these slaves did move and span enormous geographies to that extent. So thank you for your intervention. And yes.
When you describe the ways in which Indian slavery officially didn't exist, but really it did, it has some resonance for me with the experience of free blacks supposedly after emancipation here in New England in the 1780s. And I wondered if you or anyone else has made that connection, that free blacks then became treated like Indians, and they were indentured, and they were, it's all the same.
Yeah, that's a very good, very keen observation. I don't treat this particular episode, but I do note in passing in the book that in the aftermath of the passage of the 13th Amendment, many southern states passed the so-called black codes that essentially criminalized things like vagrancy or indecent gestures or this kind of thing. Because the 13th Amendment had its own obvious loophole, that is, you cannot be in prison except for a crime, then these activities, so it was a little, so each area had its own particular adaptation to its particular legal system. But I make the point that certainly Native Americans from the West would have found the black codes and the activities revolving around quite familiar. So the question is, I don't know where these black codes came from, if that was an earlier practice, or it had been something that had been borrowed from the West, or possibly from the Caribbean, where also, many of these owners in the South had many connections to the Caribbean, where these practices were also, so again.
Well, Joanne Pope Mellish's work has traced them here in New England from the 1780s.
Right.
As soon as there were manumissions.
Right.
There were black codes.
Right. I mean, it was the obvious thing to do to get around the prohibitions. I think it's one of the most astounding, I guess, discoveries that I made is that time and again, when efforts are made to liberate these Indians, owners really find a way to get around these prohibitions and retain mastery. Yep. Yes?
So, it's only recently that we're having real discussions about first people being enslaved in such large numbers. Up until recently, people always say that Native Americans were no smarter than blacks, they weren't enslaved. They refused to be enslaved. And of course, we know the truth. So this is the same as black slavery, a nation denying its history, and also lying about when things ended. What is your theory on this? About a nation that's successful. I mean, black folks were slaves right until the 1940s and 50s. They were sharecroppers. And if you got ready to leave the sharecropper, arrest you, and then you'd be in jail, which would be worse than being a sharecropper.
Sure.
So all of this is the same. It's, you know, I'm getting, I'll say this and I'll stop. Recently, I've been to 11 lectures this year, and each one angers me more, not because of what happened, but because of the denial.
Right. Well, I mean, in the case of Native or of Indian slavery, one of the reasons why it's hard to, or what it's not so obvious as African slavery is because, first of all, it was outlawed, right? So right there you have a problem with the sources, right? Unlike African slavery where you can look at wills and other documents, here you don't have too many sources. Unlike Africans who had to cross an ocean and were counted along the way, in the case of Native Americans, you really have mentions of slaving raids, you have the occasional judicial proceedings, you sometimes find their voice, rarely, but it does happen. I mean, I was astounded that many of the Indian slaves who were shipped to Spain, they sued their masters for their freedom, and you can actually, you know, read those trials, and some of them are like 300, 400, 500, 700 pages long, and so you can find those sources. So I think one of the reasons why it's been hard, or at least slow, to get around this notion of the other slavery is simply because you need to do some detective work in order to find it, and then you also have the tremendous definitional problem because slavers wanted to obfuscate the reality of what they were doing. You also need to, you know, try to overcome that as well. So I think that's my explanation of why it's, you know, it's only now that we're grappling with this. And mine is only one of, as I said, many books on the subject that are coming out in recent years. I mean, in fact, yeah. So.
That's just a similar question. I was wondering, you know, one of the things we try to do here is to always relativize what's happening in the United States vis-a-vis other countries in the Americas. And it seems to me like this might be an opportunity to think about how indigenous slavery is treated in other parts of the Americas.
Sure.
Are there inspirational scholarly sources that you have seen that are grappling with, that are dealing with this question?
Sure. Thank you. So one of the, so my book is really focused on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the United States, but occasionally I do glimpse at the larger picture. And in particular, I was floored when I stumbled on these late 17th century Spanish Empire-wide campaign to stamp out Indian slavery, whether in Chile, in the Philippines, in Colombia, you know, the Caribbean, northern Mexico. And as I got deeper into that, I looked at the scholarship. So for example, I found that there is a very active work of scholars in Chile, for example, documenting the enslavement of Mapuche Indians from the south of Chile into northern Chile, and some of them were sent to the mines in Peru, on the coast of Peru. They were shipped out of Valparaiso and sent all the way to Peru. Similarly, there is good work being done on the Philippines and Indian and enslavement of native Filipinos. Some of them are not even from the Philippines. Some of them were. So I found some records of people from the Indian subcontinent who were then sold into the Philippines and then transported. So all of that to say that this is not just the United States or Mexico. I think there is a very exciting scholarship fleshing out this continental story, and so I think that there will be more really great things to come out of these.
Maybe two more questions.
Yes.
So I was wondering about, given Rhode Island's preeminent role in shipping enslaved peoples from Africa to the Americas, I'm wondering if anyone has done any research on the transportation, maybe here's the place, archival research on the transportation of Native Americans to the Caribbean on Rhode Island ships.
I think
The 70s.
I think Lynn here would be the person to.
We can talk later.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks.
Hi, I wanted to go back to the question asked by my Wampanoag friend here.
Yep.
I think what I wondered also was there any evidence in your research of these authorities in the Southwest piecing together, as did the early European settlers and the authorities pieced together, purposeful legislation designed to enslave the Native Americans as a justification for their taking them in war or whatever situation they took them in?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing. That's one of the incredible things about this, is that even though it was illegal and all of that, the owners and the officials colluded with the owners were often quite open about what they were doing. So, for example, in these indentured legislations passed in California, New Mexico, and Utah, if you go into the debates, it is very clear. So in California, for example, that legislation revolving around the Indians was put together by Mariano Vallejo, the guy who I told you was sending out these slaving expeditions, as well as a Southerner, a U.S. from the South who had moved to California, and added some new twist to the traditional practice of indentured in California that had been practiced for decades. So they were pretty open about it, and you can find it in the documentation leading up to the passage of these laws. The same thing goes in New Mexico. I mean, New Mexico, in the same law that passed, that confirmed that if you held an African slave, you were okay, nothing was going to, reaffirm your rights, passed another indenture law vis-a-vis the Indians. So they were not trying to hide what they were doing. They were pretty open about this. And similarly, when the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, learned that there were Indians being held as slaves in New Mexico, he ordered the Minister of the Interior, James Harlan, to investigate. There was an investigation into the counties of northern New Mexico and what is now southern Colorado, Conejos and Costilla counties, and dozens of Indian slaves appeared. And the families readily declared that they had some of these, in other words, they were not hiding anything. So that's at least one of the things that it is possible to find the records, because they exist.
So when I found out that Andrés had never stepped foot in the JCB, even though his work really deeply engages with the kinds of questions that we ask here, I thought that was reason enough to invite him to come and give a talk. But clearly this is a topic that is in many ways being explored deeply now in some ways, in some sources, for the first time. And so it's wonderful to see this all put together. I do want to mention a couple things. We have a reception at the end. We have books to purchase and to have signed. We also have what is the soft opening tonight for our newest exhibition, which is called The Americas on Fire, part of a 4-year series on the environmental history of the Americas. So please take a look at that. Finally, I'd like to thank Tara Kingsley again, our coordinator of academic programming, for the work that she's done to Lynn Fisher, who is really, we're fortunate to have here as one of the leading scholars in indigenous slavery. To all of you for joining us from all corners of Rhode Island and beyond, and at Brown. And finally, to Andrés Reséndez for giving us really a fascinating glimpse into this very complex and troubling world and for writing a phenomenal book. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks so much.